Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Elaine. I'm always just so happy to get to talk to you.
Well, I feel the same way. I'm very happy to be here with you.
And I think, I probably speak for everybody here. I feel that for 40 years and more, I've been instructed by you on Adam and Eve, Satan, the Gospels, the book of Revelation, and now your new book, Miracles and Wonder, seems to be, because it's about Jesus, the sort of crowning piece of the puzzle. And I want to talk to you about that, partly because, as you know, it was the May Book Club selection at the festival. But I also want to go later to the larger implications, the future of religion, the meaning of religion. And your last book, which is such a moving personal book, Why Religion, I'll incorporate too. But if somebody were asking me what your new book is about, I would say a very close reading of the four Gospels, to show how many differences there are between them, very significant ones, and also to put them in a historical context so we can understand that they were written for a purpose. How would you describe the book? And is that wrong? Or?
Well, it's the culmination of having been teaching about the beginning of Christianity for a long time. And finally, and the other books are all specific, as you say, they're about, different topics. But this one, I was trying to talk about what do we know about Jesus of Nazareth historically? What do we not know? And why does it matter? Why does anybody read those stories or think about them now? Why do I? I was asking myself that question. So I wanted to take in everything we had in the New Testament, the secret Gospels, the political, social, military history of Israel at the time, and try to look at a whole picture as much as possible.
And in a sense, as you were saying, it's a lot about how much we don't know about Jesus, wouldn't you say? Because I'd never realized that there were such discrepancies between the four Gospels.
Well, most of us don't, because they usually get read, sort of put into the same soup. And so they're all told together. But the earliest story is just 15 pages. That's all we had. And two of the others are simply revisions of that one. So there's probably about 90% or 95% about who was Jesus of Nazareth that we simply don't know.
And some of the Gospels, there are no shepherds, there's no manger. I'd always thought that was essential to the story.
It's essential to the Christmas story. But the Christmas story wasn't part of the original story at all. There was nothing about the birth of Jesus in the earliest stories. So, and the other question you raised is, why were they written? So often they're taken as if they were histories or biographies. They have some biographical material, but they're not written for that. They're really written by followers of Jesus to say, this was his message. This is what's important. Come join our group. So they're less about Jesus, really, than about what they felt was important about what he taught.
Yes, it made me think that if any of us here were to write, let's say, about Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., we all know these are heroic figures whose teachings we want to pass on. None of us knew them. All we're getting, to some extent, to the stories we've heard and read about them. Would it be comparable for the writers of the Gospels?
Yes, except that most people would have been, of course, illiterate. Maybe 15% of the population would be literate, and those people would not be out on the fields of Galilee listening to some rabbi or prophet, So what they learned was things they remembered, of course, and stories they told. So it would be far less than what we knew about these recent figures.
And stories they heard, probably, yes? Stories that have been passed down from...
They passed down and other people changed, and they added better endings in some cases.
Yeah, and one of the things, because of your erudition, you point out that things like the Immaculate Conception were notions routinely used in biographies of that time of great people. I think you say certain accounts of Plato, of Alexander, of Augustus Caesar, they all talk about Immaculate Conceptions.
Well, sort of. I mean, the idea is that if you were a very important person, you should have a god in your genealogy. Julius Caesar had Venus in his genealogy. Alexander the Great had a god in his genealogy. And so you would have some divine mix in your makeup as a human being. But the idea, but those were all ideas that somehow the gods inserted themselves in the process of conception. It was not the idea that there was no sexual conception of Jesus. That's quite unusual, and that's what you find in this story.
Yes.
And the virgin birth is rather unique, although there are many stories about miraculous births, like the birth of the Buddha. But I don't know if it is said to be without any male participation.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know either.
How do we? Yes.
No, I think Mary probably has the monopoly on that one. And then, one of the things I love in that context is you tell us the story of Apollonius, who is a wanderer and a healer at the same time, and garlanded in many remarkable stories.
Yes, I mean, we find other stories very much like the story of Jesus. That's one of the first things you learn in graduate school. There's nothing very unique about the story of Jesus. I mean, there are other rabbis who heal people miraculously or change the weather. There are many people, Roman emperors can heal people too. And Apollonius is a story about a philosopher who also exorcised demons, raised the dead, and his story is patterned on the story of Jesus, written about 30 years later, partly to say, Jesus, he wasn't that unique. The followers of Apollonius wanted to promote him as the great teacher.
And I think I also learned that really each of the four gospel writers did have a different motive or was trying to pass on a different kind of message.
Well, there's similarities, in the three gospels because they're both just Matthew and Luke, we call them, but they're just revisions of Mark's gospel. And all of those names anyway are added in the 2nd century. So the idea is supposed to be, of course, that Jesus' personal followers wrote these down. But as far as we know, they couldn't write or read. And so these are written quite a bit later, 40, 50, 60, 70 years later. And by people who never, as you said, they didn't know those people at all. So what they do, so I was interested in why are these stories so compelling? I mean, they still speak to people in so many ways. I was amazed to think how artists today, how filmmakers, how musicians, and many other people draw on those stories and think of why they would be so compelling.
And maybe it is because they're stories more than histories. In other words, they're stories aimed at the imagination to some extent, would you say?
Yes, they're about a man who has extraordinary power, divine power. This idea of grace, which is charis, is a divine gift. So this man has amazing power, and the power comes from God. At least that's the message they want to say. Where does that come from? And if his power comes from God, his message does too. And the message is that the kingdom of God is coming. It's not ever explained what that means, which helps, because then it can mean so many things to different people.
Yes, and then it makes me think that when Barbara Taylor Brown was engaging you in discussion about this book, she pounced on the word wonder and pointed out the title is not Miracles and Wonders, but it's wonder. And what I love about wonder is it has at least two meanings. It means speculate, but it also means marvel at.
Yes.
And I was thinking about how, in some ways, we're marveling at, wondering at these stories as much as believing them. Is that a fair thing? Wonder opens us up, and belief sometimes closes us down, I feel.
Well, yes. I mean, I really think it's the American habit, that was also sort of canonized at the beginning of the 20th century. The idea is that the Bible has to be true, and you have to believe it. A group of ministers, mostly Protestant, thought, well, we're all over the map. We're Congregationalists and Methodists and Baptists and, Christian Scientists, all these other people. So what do we agree on? And they said, well, we have to agree on something. So we'll call it the fundamentals. The fundamentals are, you have to believe every word of the Bible is literally true. And that kind of kills the idea of wonder. That's a very different kind of approach. So many people who say, well, these stories, I just can't believe all of that stuff. they leave them and they say, well, this is just nonsense. That's what some members of my family did. They just said, this is unbelievable. But I think you're totally on the right track to say it's not about belief. It's about opening you up to a different kind of state of awareness.
And wonder brings us into a shared space. We're living in a very divided time, and we're divided by our beliefs. But wonder is something everyone in this room can participate in. Let's say we're seeing a beautiful sunset or whatever, regardless of the words or explanations we put on it.
Yes, it's these stories, I realized after a while that they have a pattern that I hadn't really noticed. And the pattern is one that they borrow from the scriptures, because the writers didn't think they were writing scriptures. The writers of the New Testament stories didn't think they were writing the Bible. The Bible was the Hebrew Bible. And so they patterned their stories on the Bible, so that when they do tell a story about the birth of Jesus, they make it follow the birth of Moses, who escapes from a slaughter that the Pharaoh of Egypt planned to kill all the Jewish babies, but Moses miraculously escapes. So Matthew says, well, and then there was an evil Jewish king who tried to kill all the Jewish babies because he thought they were a threat to him. That's King Herod, and Jesus miraculously escapes. Or the story of the birth of Isaac, which is said in the Hebrew Bible to be a miracle because his mother was 99 years old when he was born. Biologically impossible. And of course, the point is that God intervened. Yes. And so the story is told in Luke's gospel about the birth of Jesus, about the birth of John the Baptist. So they pattern it on that. And the pattern is that you start a story in this world we live in. We've been hearing about this week where there's war and there's oppression and there's suffering and there's violence and cruelty. But then the story opens up into hope. It suddenly opens just when you think everything is lost. They open up, like the people oppressed in Egypt are being mercilessly treated. And then their God intervenes and they escape. They find a glorious new land, which is their land. They create a great people. Or Daniel in the lion's den, or Jonah in the whale. Just when you think been swallowed by a whale, he brings you right back up. And then the story of Jesus, which is really the most horrendous in some ways, as I hear it, the poignancy of the story. He's abandoned by all of his friends. He's unjustly accused of a capital crime and tortured and publicly executed in a horrible way, and dies saying that God has abandoned him. What could be worse? And then the story says, but that's not the end. Something opens up, and something unexpected, something divine happens, a miracle. And that's why I finally realized that when I was younger, Pico, I sort of skipped over the miracles because I thought, well, it's really about the teachings, isn't it? And the teachings matter a lot. But the idea that you find in the stories, that is the structure of the stories, rather than the idea, is that they open up, and that any situation, no matter how dire, can open up unexpectedly by some kind of divine grace. And that's what wonder is about.
And I think you point out how it's often the people who are really in suffering or afflicted who find such hope and redemption in this story. That's part of the way the story lives.
It is. I got so much interested, as you know, in why are people still converting to this movement? It's still the largest tradition in the world. And if you look at people, for example, the Dalit in India, who see the gospel. I was reading the work of an American anthropologist who went to work among the people who clean the sewers in India and who are not humans according to the caste system traditionally. They receive the message that everyone is created in the image of God and that they are blessed by God. and they embraced Christianity. And that's where this American anthropologist from California said he first heard the message of justice and, God's justice and righteousness and love for the people who need it most, who need joy and help and redemption.
And I was thinking, and just this morning actually, I was taking a walk, and I was thinking, when we listen to Bach, when we step into Notre Dame in Paris, when we see a Leonardo, we feel uplifted, we feel cleansed, we feel returned to our deeper selves. And again, it doesn't have to do with belief in all those cases. It's that the imagination is taking us to a place of wonder.
Yes, and to a sense of openness to possibility, which we otherwise, if we were feeling discouraged and depressed, we wouldn't even consider that opportunity or that miracle that might happen.
Yes.
Of course, a miracle, as I'm thinking of it, is an interpretation of an event, right? You can say, I was thinking of a friend of mine who was hit by a car, and she was hit 20 feet and landed perfectly fine. And she said, it's a miracle. And I thought somebody else would say, I was really lucky. Is it luck? Is it a fluke? Or is it a miracle? And this interpretation of miracle is deeply part of all of the stories in the Bible.
Yes. Yes.
From the beginning, from Genesis to the end.
Yes. And I think actually one of the liberating kind of refrains in the book, almost the message of the book, sometimes is, I don't know. As a scholar, you say you address lots of theories, but you're not approving them, you're not dismissing them, you're saying we're in this position of we don't know exactly.
Well, because there's so little we do know historically about Jesus of Nazareth, many people have lots of theories of which they're extremely certain. So I try to present the different views, but I can't be certain. I just have to say, there are these possibilities. There's so much we don't know. But that doesn't matter. What matters is the story communicates the hope that's built into it.
Yes. You're liberating us from the ways that we reduce the story and really expanding it, I think.
Well, I think the writers are doing that.
Yes. And I think the other word that kept on coming up to me reading it was secret. And, history will always remember you as the one who shared with us the Gnostic Gospels, the 52 books that appeared in 1945. But one thing I learned, especially from this work of yours, was they're not contradicting the four Gospels. They're complementing them, or they're giving us a different side to Jesus' teaching.
Oh, yes. The secret Gospels, or initially when we started to work on them, people said, oh, these are the really great ones, and the others are not. Or they'd say, these are trash, and the ones in the New Testament are the real Gospels. But now we realize that Jewish teachers, like spiritual teachers in any tradition that I know, don't teach one way. If you're a rabbi in the first century or today, you teach one thing to a congregation. And then there's some of people who are close to you, who are learning from you, as some people said about a great Hasidic master. We didn't come to hear what he preached. We came to see how he tied his shoes. So that's what they learn. And those people, he teaches different things. And Jesus, in the Gospel of Mark, says, when he was alone with his disciples, he taught them secretly. And he taught them things that he said, these things I'm telling you a mystery. I'm not telling people out there, I'm just telling them parables. And preachers say, oh, that's because Jesus likes to make them nice and simple. It's about the farmer and the watering the plants. And it's sort of baby steps. But he says, no, I'm telling them those stories so that they won't understand. But I'm telling you the truth. And telling not the truth, but the deeper truth. So in the Gospel of Mark, he speaks to them privately and tells them the mystery of the kingdom of God. But Mark doesn't tell you what it is. The secret Gospels claim to tell you. The Gospel of Thomas focuses entirely on what is the secret of the kingdom of God. The Greek word is mystery, mysterion. Mystery, secret. And there, the secret of the kingdom of God is not the redemption of Israel's glory in the past. It's that the kingdom of God is a state of being in which you live in the presence of divine grace. It's an internal reality. And so these are not contradictory. These are complementary.
Yes. I mean, as you know, because I know you've been teaching at Princeton this class on Jesus and the Buddha spoke of useful means, which is the perfect description of this.
Yes.
And to this day, the Dalai Lama, when he's in Aspen, will give us a general teaching, and
Yes.
then when he's back with his monks, a completely, different one, but just deeper for the speaking to the context and to their particular position in life. And I think, that one of the beauties of this book is you remind us of some of what's in the Gospels, the secret Gospels. And there's this wonderful moment about being in the light. I wonder if you could share that. Do you know what I'm speaking of?
Which?
Where do you come from?
Oh, yes. Well, the secret Gospels, one thing that persuades me that the Gospel of Thomas, this recently found text, is nevertheless probably contains a lot of actual teaching of Jesus. That's always a question we have to ask. Is that it's not a New Testament story. It's not a Christian story. People forget that Jesus wasn't a Christian. I mean, Christianity was invented. It became a movement maybe 2 or 3 generations after his death. But in this text, he talks about Genesis. And Genesis starts with the words that, when before God created the universe, he said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and the light streams in the darkness, and darkness has never overcome it. And so the Gospel of Thomas has Jesus speak about, where do you come from? It's not from England or, where your family is from or from Santa Barbara, but you come from the light, where the light came into being at the beginning of time. And then he says, it's like when you're transitioning from one country to the other, the questions are, who are you? Where do you come from? And who is your family? So where do you come from? He says, say this. Say, we come from the light, where the light came into being at the beginning of time. That's where all of us come from. And if they ask, who are you? Say, we're children of the light. We're not talking about our literal parents, our biological parents, but we are children of the living Father, the light, or the living Mother, which was understood to be the Holy Spirit because, of course, in Hebrew, the word for spirit is a feminine word, ruach, or also chokhmah, wisdom. So this is a teaching about who we are on a spiritual level. And I think that is the mystery that Jesus speaks about in Mark, but it's not disclosed in the New Testament. It's waiting for when you're ready to hear that.
Yeah. And as you say, it's not a Christian story, but it's also not an unchristian story. And I think the fact that Buddhists and mystics and many other people can respond to it doesn't mean it's a violation of the Christian.
Not at all. Teaching. I didn't certainly mean that.
No.
Because the Christian story comes out of, well, this in particular, specifically, it comes out of Genesis, but it comes out from some much deeper human experience that, as you say, is recognized and articulated in, say, Buddhist culture in a different language, in different metaphors for that culture.
Yeah, it made me think it's much better to be in the light than to be in the right. I mean, really, it's in the light that we want to be in.
I like that.
Rather than enforcing our notion of the... Now, anyone who's read your previous book, Why Religion, is never going to forget it and the power of it. And one thing that I wanted to ask you, if I may, was I remember, you'd faced some terrible tragedies. You lost your husband near here. You lost your son, 6-year-old son. And near here at Snowmass, I remember you said Father Thomas Keating gave you great solace in a time of immense loss. And I've always wondered, when you think about that now, do you think that's partly because he was a monk? Do you think it's partly because he was a fellow Christian? Or do you think it was just his human essence and kindness and wisdom?
Well, it was all of those things.
Yeah.
I mean, Thomas, of course, was raised in Christian tradition, and he deepened it. I mean, he opened it up in so many ways, contemplative. beyond words, beyond doctrine, beyond, you know, I thought the Gospel of Thomas he would think of as a heretical text, but he immediately took it into his own deep understanding, lifelong understanding of a spiritual path, and made it his own. And he articulated something very similar, which is much deeper than his particular tradition, of course, as he knew, because he was always talking with Buddhists and with many other people, all kinds of people. I remember going to the monastery with 2 Orthodox Jews, and the monks offered them the Eucharist, which is counter to the Bishop of Denver, as they well knew. And it was something, it was a gesture of welcome, a gesture of inclusion and invitation.
And now, of course, after Father Thomas Keating's death, that property is up for sale in Snowmass, the beautiful monastery that you went to. And I've been thinking that the church may end up $150 million richer after the sale of that, but it and all of us will be so much poorer.
That monastery, so many people here, how many people have been there?
Oh,
I mean,
well,
this was a spiritual center, right, for all kinds of us. and we felt its presence, whether we went there or not. It's a sacred place. And it was sacred before that to the indigenous people who lived there for maybe thousands of years. So there's still 4,000 acres there, beautiful, pristine land. It's the only piece of land like it that's left. So many people in the community are hoping that a group of people will find another use for it so that it could become a spiritual center, really interfaith center, but also one that could offer healing, retreat, maybe hospice, maybe yoga and meditation and all kinds of resources for healing the community as it did before, and maybe even with an expanded openness.
Because I feel going to all the other events at the festival this week reminds us we're desperate for that. We're desperate for that wider perspective and for some deeper truth or deeper peace. This is a time of unusual tumult and dividedness. And what you're describing, I think, is what most people are craving, however they define it.
Yes, I was thinking recently, when many people who live here know that a wonderful, beloved member of the community was dying slowly, and we all knew that, and then he died. There's not much of a way to die here. There's not much of understanding about how do we deal with life and death. What is the meaning of that when we look at that? And the monastery spoke to that. It embraced people in a much greater dimension than you see anywhere else. Well, not anywhere else, but in this valley, that was the one place where I felt that people could go and be open to it.
Yes, because it was crossing all borders and speaking to all humans, it sounds like.
And in silence, largely.
That's the universal language.
In silence.
In fact, didn't Father Thomas Keating used to say that silence is the language of God and everything else is a poor translation?
If he didn't, he would have liked to.
Yes. So nowadays, I mean, speaking of interfaith, a lot of people will say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious.
Yes.
I'm wondering, do you think something fundamental is being lost in that transition, as it were?
Well, it can be, because spiritual is a fuzzy word. It can mean an aspiration, that I have a sense of something more, something that transcendent to our human reality that conveys meaning to it. But when we talk about religion, I mean, the word talks about being connected.
Yeah, religio, right?
Yeah, religio is about being connected. And those practices, whether it's Buddhist, whether it's Catholic, whether it's Protestant or other kinds of groups, they offer practices, they offer communities that many of us miss. I mean, I miss that now that the monastery isn't here.
Yes.
Simply going there, hearing them chant the prayers in the evening, sitting in that silent chapel, hearing the monks.
Yes.
So I think many of us need that. I've gone to other churches here and haven't found that kind of depth, frankly, that many of us went to the monastery to find.
Sense of belonging in some ways.
Yes, and those monks lived in a very deep space.
Yes. Yes.
Of joy, actually,
Yes.
in many ways.
Yeah. And I think also religion kind of puts us in place. It reminds us we're in a much larger context of history, and that we're walking or praying in the footsteps of generations of other people. We're not trying to forge our own lonely way through the desert, in many ways.
Yes.
So, when well, this is a bit of it sounds trifling, but I don't think it is. I mean, I know when you were young, you knew Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, and when people sought out the Grateful Dead, I think what they were searching for was that sense of community and this kind of subculture within the larger culture that was based on trust and love and affirmation. And even in that small, not so exalted example, I think it speaks for something that we're all hungering for, that we don't find if we're just trying to carve out our own belief system.
Yes, that was a time when I was in high school, and he hadn't started that group, but it was the music. It was his amazing love, passion for music, and his working at it his entire life. He never quit. He was also deeply Catholic, and he was aware of it. I mean, he went to the cathedral, Episcopal Cathedral in San Francisco to hear the Bach, to hear that kind of music too. So he embraced who he was in terms of the culture, his culture, but opened up to a world without doctrine or dogma, in which people were welcome into a spiritual community, which is what many people there were seeking and found.
Music, as much as silence, is what crosses every border and brings us back to our deeper self often. Now, you still go to church, and so that speaks for you're still receiving deep sustenance from that tradition.
For a long time, I didn't.
I see.
Because the church I went to in Princeton, it's a beautiful old church, has wonderful, the Episcopal church, I like it because they're sort of musical snobs, and they sing Palestrina, and they sing Bach, and they sing Thomas Tallis, and this ancient chant music, like the monks. And so I went for the music, but there wasn't a spiritual center until there was a priest who embodied that, who welcomes people, who opens his heart to everyone who comes. And when his presence is there and that music, then you have something. And then there's something to go to. And there's a community that all shares and loves that. And when you're lucky enough to find that kind of community and person and place, that's especially, it makes it easier to think about a spiritual life, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it reminds us that the doctrine is much less important than the human embodiment of the doctrine. That's what really either welcomes us or shuts us out.
Well, Jesus wasn't teaching doctrine. He was teaching about the kingdom of God, which is a very, as I said, it's an elusive term. What does it mean? He was teaching about hope and saying the world is in suffering now, as I said, but something will happen. Some glorious opening may occur, and you can be part of it. And I think that is the message that the gospel writers were trying to share. They believed that, and they started a movement in which everyone could join, in which it wasn't a matter of being a Roman citizen and having enough money to go to the temple and buy an animal for sacrifice or pay the priest to do a service for you. Everyone was welcome. The poor were welcomed. People enslaved, people who were not humans in the Roman Empire because they were property as they were seen, were welcomed in to a community that said, well, among us, there's neither slave nor free person. It doesn't matter if you're Jew or Greek or male or female. We're all one. We're all the same. Now, socially, that was completely untrue. But spiritually and within that group, it was true. And people were welcomed. And that's why the movement grew and horrified the wealthy and educated people who saw crowds of rabble, as they said. These people are nothing. And yet they grew into a community. And one of the teachers he was a teacher in Africa, in North Africa. He said, they say about us, look how they love each other. They have children who are orphans. They give them food. There are women who are destitute, who might have to prostitute themselves to survive, but they bring them in and they feed them. They make them part of the community. He said, that's how they love each other. That's how people see us. And he said that movement was unstoppable, even though it was intensely persecuted by the Romans as followers of a revolutionary against the Roman government. It was capital punishment, if you joined that group.
And that's why people are joining it even now. So I'm wondering, we talked about Snow Mass closing for the moment, more and more people defining themselves as none of the above, nuns. Are you worried about the future of religion?
No.
Good.
I don't feel responsible for it, first of all. Because, the death of religion has been proclaimed a number of times. And it seems to be part of human nature to seek that kind of transcendence. I always think of Viktor Frankl, A Man's Search for Meaning, in a time of utter desperation and utter horror in Auschwitz. He writes about how does anyone find meaning? And he found it. He said he was not a religious man. He was a psychiatrist before he was imprisoned. But he speaks about a vision he had of his wife when he was in the prison. And he didn't know if she was alive or dead. I think she had died by then. But he said it didn't matter. He had a vision of his wife and the love they had. And it lifted him out of that. And he said, that's what kept me alive, was that vision. And he talked about that and about finding meaning. And he also wanted to go on and live and talk about how people can survive what they think they can't survive. I mean, I admit that I was going through things that you mentioned, and I thought there was a time, not that I couldn't survive, I didn't want to. But we had just adopted 2 little children. I had to. And not just that, I wanted to go on and live for them. And so that kind of meaning is what he talked about. We live for each other. And we need each other in that process.
I have a friend who's a writer in New York, and because he's a writer, he let me in on this secret, which is whenever he picks up a new book, he goes right to the very last word, because he knows as a writer there's going to be so much emotional culmination that all centers on that last word. And he feels the secret key of any book is in the last word. So the last phrase in your book is outburst of hope. And just as we're listening to you, that's what we're feeling, hope. So it's wonderful that I think as you survey the future, your hope is undiminished.
Well, it's been challenged, like all of us, very harshly in the last few months. And yet, we have to have that. I mean, that is what impels us to move and gather here and talk about how we're going to do that, how we're going to get together and change what needs to be changed, and go on trying to create more space in the world, more vision and more love and more inclusion.
Now, this is such intimate material, so close to us, that I'm sure many of you have questions. I think there are mics, and I see hands shooting up. So this gentleman in the blue, I noticed first.
Yes, hi, I'm Holden Thorpe. I'm the editor of Science, and I used to be the provost at WashU, and I hosted you
Yes.
a few times.
You did.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
all you write about. So you make a very compelling case, and you've made it before, that it was a momentous decision when the Gospel of John was decided. It was decided that it would be in the New Testament because it shifted the emphasis away from the teachings of Jesus to more of the supernatural stuff. So for some of us, maybe that wasn't the greatest decision in the world. But do you think that Christianity would have survived if the Gospel of John hadn't been put in?
Well, that's
Humans need
yeah,
the material that's in there in order to sustain the religion beyond the teachings?
I don't know. I mean, when I was briefly in an evangelical group, that was considered to be the most spiritual gospel. That is, you have to believe that Jesus is God. And that's what, in the Gospel of John, John has a message. And Jesus keeps saying over and over in the Gospel of John that I am He, I am God. I can't believe Jesus ever said that as a rabbi. I mean, in Matthew, he says to somebody who says, you know, good rabbi, and of course the word in Greek in the New Testament for Jesus, when they talk about teacher is rabbi, they say rabbi, and he says, why do you call me good? The only one that is good is God. So Matthew has a very different picture, a much more traditional picture. I lost my love for the Gospel of John because it's turned so often into dogma. Now, when Father Thomas read it very differently. Thomas read it with such an open heart that it included everything that he understood as a man of the Spirit. So I don't know, some people can read it very differently. But you said excludes the supernatural. I think there's a lot that goes beyond what we call natural. That is, natural is what we can, phenomena for which we have evidence, and we can demonstrate it scientifically, right? Because the evidence can be repeatedly explored. But there are events that are not like that at all. So I think there are events that go beyond what we think of as natural. I mean, I got to be more aware of that as I was writing, and maybe more as I got older. I mean, it's different. So I guess I'm more open to what people think of as miracles, although more often I take them as signs and metaphors. But they do happen, as many of us know. So thank you. That's a tough question, but it's an important one.
Yes, the lady next to the mic.
Thank you, dearest Elaine. This
Tracy.
is a tougher question, I think, but I'm really destroyed by the rise in anti-Semitism that is happening, and that the anti-Semitism and all of the hatred that has come with so much religion. And so can you both address that?
That's so important, Tracy. I'm glad you did speak of it. I mean, what comes to my mind is how many people, how artists like you as a dancer, how many artists are using the story of Jesus still. And one of the most powerful is Marc Chagall, who is, of course, a Jewish artist. He painted so many pictures, you can see them in Nice, of Moses and the prophets, and the Hebrew Bible was something in which he was deeply immersed. But in 1938, when his art was declared decadent by the Nazis, and he had to leave Germany and flee to France and finally to the United States over the Alps, he painted one subject, and that was crucifixions. So his painting, if you look at the White Crucifixion in Chicago, the university, the Art Institute of Chicago, it's a picture of Jesus on the cross with a tallis, a prayer shawl across his loins, and above him is the Lord speaking to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Hebrew, saying, "This is my beloved son." And you're thinking, what is Chagall saying? He's saying, hey, you are putting my people in ovens to murder them because you say they killed Jesus? First of all, that story is completely untrue. And I wrote a book about it when I realized how terribly untrue it is that the Jews killed Jesus. But Chagall is also saying, but Jesus is one of us, and you are doing this to us. And it was both a rebuke to Christian anti-Semitism, which has become virulent, right, in Europe, and throughout the world in some places. And so I think that's very important to remember, that he comes from this tradition, and the tradition is about loving each other. The tradition challenges all of that hatred, but especially the question of Christian anti-Semitism. That one really got me when I was working historically, when I realized that that the Gospels turned the responsibility for the crucifixion from Pontius Pilate, who ordered the crucifixion of Jesus because he assumed that Jesus was just another of those crazy Jewish revolutionaries who were trying to fight against Roman domination. That's why he was crucified. But followers of Jesus couldn't admit that, because they realized that then they would be seen as revolutionaries themselves and become targets for Rome. So they turned the story to suggest that it wasn't about that Jesus wasn't a revolutionary. I don't think he was. But they turned it to the Romans, from the Romans, and created a story that wasn't dangerous in the first century, but it was very dangerous after followers of Jesus and Christians became the rulers of the Roman world, and they began to legislate Christian anti-Semitism. So we still see that a lot.
Thank you. I saw, yes, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Eric Citrullo. I run a speaker series in Montecito, California, and am on a board of an interfaith spiritual retreat called Nine Gates, ninegates.org. My question is there's been some speculation that Jesus, before he came back and preached, traveled, and one of those places he might have gone to is India and been exposed to Buddhist traditions as well. Before the historical period that's mostly written about. Have you come across any evidence for or against that in your investigations over the course of your career?
It's a good question. It comes up pretty often. I haven't seen any evidence for it in the first century. There were people who traveled, like the philosopher you mentioned, Apollonius of Tyana was a philosopher from Africa who traveled to India to consult the wise men, he said, sitting on the banks of the Ganges. So in the first century, people did that. Whether a village rabbi from Nazareth could have done that, it seems to me unlikely. It's not impossible. When you read the Gospel of Thomas, though, there are sayings of Jesus that sound a lot like teachings that come from India. And I do think that in that text, teachings of Jesus have gone to India with travelers. They did go, and they return shaped also by the culture of India. So there may be that mingling, certainly in the Gospel of Thomas.
Yes, please.
Hi. First of all, I'm just very grateful to have decided to come to this. I came because it said hope, and it was the only thing in the program that had the word hope in it. I have not read your book, but I'm going to go and get it as soon as we walk away from here. And so if the question I'm asking isn't relevant, it won't hurt my feelings at all to move on to the next question. But I've been a spiritual, not religious person for the last couple of decades. In the last few years, I've been reading a lot, and one of the books that took me was The Universal Christ by Richard Rohr. And so I'm interested in your perspective on that, and maybe how it relates to your book, if that's reasonable.
Well, thank you. Richard Rohr often visited the monastery, and I saw him at a conference recently. He spoke very much the language of Thomas Keating. They were brothers, in the sense of seeing Christianity as a path to a universal understanding, or a universal embrace, shall we say. And I think that's where many people are going and need to go. I mean, that's where I've needed to go. I mean, yes, I love many things about Christian tradition. I grew up in it. It speaks to me in some ways. In some ways, I think it's wrong and misleading and corrupted, perverted, twisted against itself. We see that too. But am I a Christian? I mean, I wouldn't identify, that's not who I am. That's one of the cultural pathways that I think is, it speaks to me a lot. But it's only one. And, yeah.
No, I was going to say, to me, part of the beauty of Father Richard Rohr is he always stresses that the language of truth speaks in paradox and parable, which is going to exactly what I think Elaine is saying. It's speaking to the imagination or to intimation or intuition more than the world of logic and reasoning. And I think that's why the Jesus story is one of the many reasons why they last and will last.
Yes, and the line of the Gospel of Thomas that got me totally hooked when I first read it as a graduate student, thought, what is this anyway? We were told not to touch this stuff. It was weird, dangerous nonsense. But when I got to that famous line where Jesus says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. And I thought, wow, okay. That I took it psychologically, and it works that way. But I realized later it's a theological statement. It's saying, what is within you? Because you're a human, if you come from the light, if all of us come from the original light of the universe, before there was a universe, then what is within you, according to the teachings of Genesis, is an image of God. You manifest God, you manifest light. And so it's a spiritual saying. If you bring forth that, if you don't know that you come from that infinite source and that it's being manifested in you, then you live in darkness. So it is a spiritual statement, and it goes far beyond any tradition, as far as I can see, except we have to use language.
Actually, I fear our time. Well, one very quick question
Yes.
and quick answer.
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, Eleni.
Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you. What comes to mind is that this kind of universal spirituality should be taught in schools, because it may not be taught in the same way at home, and particularly given the amount of broken families in the United States, for example. What do you think of actually moving towards the teaching of what's common among all religions and about the human spirit, and it be taught as you should be teaching civics, for example, in public schools?
Well, I like the idea of especially teaching in middle school about the different traditions, because they're teaching cultural traditions. But there is, in this country, a sort of allergy about teaching religion in schools because there's so many different ways people do it. And there would be people teaching things that you and I would find reprehensible. So unless you have a curriculum, I just think that may not be the place we can do it.
But it's worth a book. It's worth a book. It's worth a textbook as how it should be taught. It is worth a textbook as how it should be taught. Because history is also taught in many perverted ways.
Well, that's
all
true.
kinds of things that are taught in literature is taught in perverted ways.
Well, that's true. Certainly, when we teach graduate students at Princeton, you can study Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And so we teach them all as, I mean, we don't put it this way because we're not theologians, we're historians, but they're conduits to some sense of purpose and meaning and some deeper realities, like any kind of poetic language. That's a very interesting question. I'll have to think about that more.
So we come from the light, and I'm so inspired to see so many hands up. We have to depart now, but I'm sure Elaine will keep answering questions when you run into her. Thank you all for being here.